Well, looky what we have. What? What? Look what we have here. I didn't just bend it at all by accident. No. The second Tales from the Pizzaplex book, titled Haps, just came out 3 days ago, and in this video I'm going to be going over the first story in the book titled Help Wanted. The name Help Wanted should sound familiar to fans of FNaF since that is actually the name of FNaF VR, Help Wanted. So that should already give you a hint as to what this story will be about, and it's honestly about something I never thought we would get a full answer to. But we have now. The only thing I know about the story is what the previews show, and even those I didn't completely read. For the most part, this story is going to be completely new for me. The other two stories, titled Haps and B7, I know absolutely nothing about those, so those are 100% going to be completely new for me, just like Lally's Game and Under Construction were. Summaries for those stories are going to be out hopefully tomorrow and the day after, but if not, they will be out as soon as I can get them out. So I hope you guys enjoy, and let's get started. The main character of Help Wanted is a man named Steve Snodgrass. Steve is an aspiring video game creator working crappy jobs for minimum wage while also applying for jobs at big tech companies, but always getting beat out by someone else. Steve had recently been working on a family-friendly fetch quest game called Chip Off the Old Block, similar to Chipper and Sons Lumber Co., the game made by Scott which led to the creation of FNaF. Steve was hoping that some bigger company would show interest in his work, and if not, he'd just publish the game himself. Steve had also recently been on 2 dates with a woman named Amanda, who he met on a dating app. The issue was that their work schedules were completely incompatible, but they did text often. One day, Steve was approached at work by some very strange man who seemed to know who Steve was. Steve was worried that he could be a cop or even a serial killer, or maybe part of the mafia, and for some reason I can't understand for the life of me, I kept picturing Gustavo Fring when reading this guy's lines, but his name is Brock Edwards, and he works for Fazbear Entertainment. You can probably see where this is going. Also, can we just talk about the fact that his name is Brock Edwards, and if you switch around his name, it would be Edward Brock, aka Eddie Brock, Venom. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, I found a lot of funny details like that in the story that were probably just coincidences, but really reminded me of some of other media. Steve recognized the Freddy Fazbear Entertainment brand name from when he was a kid as well, and also knew about the murders. Interestingly, he had also heard what he considered to be nonsense about paranormal events related to Fazbear. Mr. Edwards explained to Steve that most people only think of the murders when thinking about Fazbear Entertainment, and that some people in the past few years have been trying to destroy the company's name by spreading these so-called rumors. He claims that because of the bad publicity, Fazbear Entertainment requires a bit of a reboot, a rebranding to bring it back to its original success, and he says that he came to Steve because he was a game developer. Steve was confused as to how he knew this and wondered what else Brock could have known. Brock told Steve that he's been offered to make 4 horror games making fun of the old murder rumors. Steve gave his decision some thought because, to him it seemed immoral. So already there's a lot to unpack here. Steve's a man working a crappy job to barely pay minimum wage, is dating a girl he met on a dating website, and is now being approached by someone from Fazbear Entertainment who offers him a job to make 4 games making fun of the old rumors. This is telling us the story of the indie game developer we learn about in FNaF VR. Remember when Tape Girl said that Fazbear Entertainment hired the game developer? This is us seeing that happen for the first time. Steve Snodgrass is the game developer. Steve Snodgrass is the in-game universe equivalent of Scott Cawthon. This also clarifies that only the first 4 FNaF games are actually canon in universe. Well, kind of. If we go off of what we see in FNaF VR, Steve ends up making FNaF 1, FNaF 2, FNaF 3, and maybe some variation of FNaF 4. That's all. None of the further FNaF games are games in universe, but rather are entirely real events. And honestly, FNaF 1, 2, 3, and 4 are obviously real events in universe too. They're just also games in the same universe that they actually happen, But then Steve rejects the offer. See, he was starting to really like Amanda, and he didn't think he'd known her for long enough to make a long-distance relationship work. And Fazbear Entertainment wanted Steve to work in a remote location so there would be no chance of leaks for the games. And Steve didn't want to have to leave. So he rejected this offer and went back inside to get to mopping the gas station that he worked at. Then we cut to Steve at home making breakfast when he strangely gets a notification on the dating app from someone named Victoria, who he found to be extremely beautiful. She had asked him if he wanted to chat with her sometime, and Steve's bozo ass typed back, sure, because apparently his relationship with Amanda was in its early stages, and they weren't exclusive, so he didn't care much. What a bozo. Somehow this guy's toast gets burnt because he wasn't paying attention, which makes no sense because toasters have timers built into them, so that's kind of stupid, but whatever. He no longer felt like eating anything, so he got back to working on Chip on the old block when he got another message from Victoria where she asked if he wanted to meet her at her house this weekend, and he said yes. He had to cancel plans with Amanda for Saturday as well, and he felt guilty about it. Then there's a short scene of Steve eating with his friend Matt and talking about Victoria, blah blah blah, not really important. Matt never pops up again, so it doesn't matter. After that, we cut to Steve making his way to Victoria's house, which had oddly enough been in a rural area. He calls for her, but she doesn't respond and the door is unlocked, so the bozo just walks in. When he does, he finds that the house is completely empty, which confused him. He also began hearing a whirring sound, and suddenly a really high-pitched sound that hurt his ears and his brain. It took me a second, but I quickly understood what was going on here, but I won't spoil anything for you guys. When he found Victoria, the ringing suddenly stopped, and he saw that she was wearing a green dress, which complemented the flecks of green in her brown eyes. Ah, yes. Okay, anyway. Victoria explained her idea for what they would be doing this evening, right before the ringing came back. Steve looked up in the direction of the sound and saw the smoke alarm flashing red, despite there being no smoke around whatsoever. He reached for the alarm to figure out what was wrong with it when he was extremely dizzy suddenly, with the room spinning faster and faster until he passed out. When he finally came to, the previously completely empty house had been completely furnished. There had been pictures on the wall of Victoria doing various things like hiking at the beach in a green swimsuit, eating ice cream on a park bench with a bit on her nose, all pretty normal stuff. Victoria herself then walks in explaining that he had a Disney spell and passed out on the couch. But Steve didn't get dizzy spells. He was also really confused, believing that they were about to have a picnic on the floor, and Victoria was confused because that was what they did on their first date, which confused Steve even more because he believed this was their first date. Victoria then told him that he had been in a car accident a few years ago and had memory loss, his memory coming and going every so often. This upset him, but it made sense to him, as it explained his lost sense of time. The next morning, he was woken up by a girl who seemed to be about 4 and a boy who seemed to be about 2 calling him daddy and saying it's time for pancakes. At the beginning of the story, it said that Steve's dream family would consist of a beautiful wife and 2 children, a boy and a girl, and that's exactly what it's like here. It seems too good to be true. So Steve and his kids go and eat breakfast, and Steve is just thinking about how this is everything that he ever wanted. His daughter's name is Abigail and his son's name is Avery, and we get a few small instances after that of Steve not knowing certain things that he believed he'd known before, until Victoria shows Steve a letter on a notice of foreclosure on their house. Not gonna lie, I had to look up what that was. Victoria tells Steve that she hadn't been working because she wanted to stay home with the kids until they started kindergarten, but now she thought that she'd have to go back to working. Steve still had his job at the gas station he worked at before, but it wasn't paying well enough to keep up with the bills, so Steve decided that he needed to get a better paying job. Then it cuts to later on in the day where Steve notices a shiny black and expensive looking car rolling up to their house. He went out to meet the man who stepped out, and it was the same man who had approached him beforehand, Brock Edwards, and Steve still recognized him and remembered his name. Mr. Edwards had come to tell Steve that the offer he had made him last time they met still stands, and that Steve doesn't have to move into some isolated area and can stay to work wherever he is most comfortable. Because of the foreclosure, Steve decided that the offer didn't seem so bad anymore and decided to take the job. That night, Steve heard a thumping sound coming from the living room. Thinking it could be an intruder, he prepared to take matters into his own hands, but when he got to the living room, he just saw Abigail blankly staring into nothing and repeatedly bumping into the coffee table. He told her to go back to bed since it was the middle of the night, and he did the same as well. When he got back into bed, Victoria asked him what he was doing, and he explained that he'd heard a noise from the living room and found lifeless Abigail in there repeatedly bumping into the table. Victoria told him that the kids sleepwalk sometimes, something they get from him. Steve often sleepwalks with night terrors, apparently. This is very interesting because, as we've gone over, Steve is the creator of the in-universe version of the FNaF games, and in Help Wanted it is implied that the FNaF 4 equivalent is a bit different to the FNaF 4 that we play. Or at least that was my thought. My idea was that one of those FNaF 4-esque minigame sections of FNaF VR is night terrors, so it's possible that Steve used his own experiences as partial inspirations. Steve also supposedly has a head injury, and having nightmares could connect him to the bite victim. Not really him himself, but his experiences are more similar. That's not to say FNaF 4 or any of the FNaF games are fake and mean nothing anymore though, since like I just said, the games are a bit different to the ones we play. It's also been blatantly confirmed by now that Mike is the player of FNaF 4, but it is still heavily implied that the bite victim did experience the nightmares, and what we play in FNaF 4 is just him inflicting those same nightmares on Michael as revenge for the bite of 83. Anyway, moving on. Steve often couldn't sleep, and Victoria always reminded him of his night terrors. In order to work on the Freddy game, he turned his small attic into the office he would work at. He always had the same visions and fears at night, so during the day he channels that fear into the game he was making. This is also most likely a reference to the fact that while working on the game, Scott oftentimes had sleepwalking nightmares about Bonnie trying to get into his room. After lunch one day, Steve played hide-and-seek with Avery and Abigail, both of which jumped out of their hiding spots before being found, clearly showing that they have absolutely no idea what the concept of this game is. But before Abigail jumped out, Steve felt anxiety, like he was worried he wouldn't find his daughter even though they were just playing a game and she was hiding somewhere in the house. But he thought about kids who actually did go missing. He started getting really worried until she eventually jumped out, and after that he just went back to working on the game. He knew how to create the jump scares because he had just gotten jump scared by his own kid. He understood the feeling of being terrified, but then realizing that it's just a game and you get relieved after that. The only thing he couldn't relate to was the relief. He recently never felt safe. He heard whirring and rumbling, and he believed that it was inside the walls, and none of this had actually been a dream because he hadn't fallen asleep. He felt the need to get out of his bedroom, but when he made it to the door, he heard the sounds from the living room too. On the wall of his bedroom was a large bubble forming until it eventually popped, and oily black liquid spattered throughout the room. He had to get out of here, so he woke up Victoria, but she said that there was nothing there. Steve saw a hole in the wall with black slime dripping out of it and onto the floor, but Victoria claimed to have seen nothing. She told him it was just a nightmare, but Steve was convinced that it wasn't. One day, the voice on the radio named DJ Dan the Music Man, interesting possibly lore-relevant name, announced that it would be snowing. This was fun at first to stay inside and play board games and stuff with his family, but Steve soon enough was worried. Because he couldn't go outside, he knew that they were here, whoever that is, I don't know yet, but Steve almost felt like the snow was caused by them, trying to keep him in his house. Steve was also literally always hearing the high-pitched ringing, interestingly enough. The blizzard had been ongoing for days, and at a certain point on the 5th day, interestingly, DJ Dan the Music Man came back in the radio announcing even more snow. There's two interesting things about this. First, through this ongoing and completely chaotic blizzard, there is absolutely zero chance that the radio signal would still be working. It would definitely be disrupted by the snowfall. And second, when DJ Dan started talking, Steve reportedly doesn't remember anyone turning on the radio, almost as if it had turned on by itself. Interesting. He also says that he's lived in this area his whole life and had never seen snow like this. Steve decided to go upstairs and continue working. He had actually finished the first game by now, and once he finished and sent Fazbear Entertainment all 4 games, he would be paid very good compensation, and all their money troubles will be gone. He's been using this feeling of dread regarding the things that had been in his house as fuel for the horror of these games, which furthers my night terrors idea, or did. He got to work on the second game, but lost track of time, and decided to take a shower before going to bed. As he undressed though, he noticed several small cuts all over his body, and had no idea where they could have come from. After his shower, he went back to the living room and just sat, waiting for something to happen. Nothing really did until the glow came from inside the fridge in the kitchen. There were sounds of the kitchen cabinet doors slamming as well, but when he went to the kitchen, he just found Avery, who told his dad he was thirsty. After getting him water and sending him back to bed, Steve reflected on what had just happened. Those sounds of slamming couldn't have been made from Avery. After all, he's a 2-year-old kid. Steve thought maybe the sounds weren't real, but he knew that the cuts were. Something had been in his house, and it was physically hurting him. The walls started growing bubbles again, popping like before, but this time terrifying snake-looking creatures with sharp teeth and a long slithering tongue came out from the hole in the wall. it actually poked him with its tongue, forming an instant bruise on his arm, and he ran from the living room and through the hall to his bedroom, passing in newly formed holes and a snake that tangled around his legs. He made it to the bedroom and shut the door, propping a chair up against it, and Victoria had been awake and she pressed him. He told her about the snakes, but she just thought that he had imagined it again. When Steve showed her the cuts on his arms, Victoria went to the bathroom and started putting antibiotic ointment on his arms. She told him that once the snow was gone, they would get him help. Steve believed that she actually meant psychiatric help, though, and she was the one person Steve knew he could trust, but she didn't believe him, and that sucked. But the noises in the house had stopped. Steve lies down, but he knows he's not going to be resting, so yeah, there's that. The next day, he cautiously opens the bedroom door to find no snakes and no holes in the wall. He thought to himself that maybe he did need some help, and he also heard DJ Dan on the radio saying that the snow might be stopped, but it won't be going away since it's still cold enough for water to freeze and therefore it won't melt. Then he says that he's here to keep us happy in this trying time by playing music, and he says he'll be playing the latest hit from Sailor Thrift. Excuse me, hold on. Sailor Thrift. Any relation to, Taylor Swift? For real, this killed me. They just replaced the T with an S and the SW with a TH. Honestly, had me dying. Anyway, so Steve is really on edge to the point where even his kids notice, and then he goes upstairs to continue to work on the games, now beginning work on the third one. The attic used to be the place full of darkness as it was where he worked on the horror world, but now it had bled out into the rest of his life. The game was the only time he didn't hear the high-pitched ringing, so yeah, the work distracted him from the darkness rather than making him feel immersed in it. He was immersed in the game development, yeah, but not so much the horror of it anymore, at least not the horror from the game. He was more scared of what else was going on in his house. The fact that this is being stated now could also be a slight reference to FNaF 3 being widely considered to be the least scary FNaF game. Steve was so immersed in development that when Victoria called up asking if he wanted something to eat, he jumped like it was a monster jump scaring him. Later on we get a scene of Steve and Victoria doing marriage lovey-dovey things, and Steve decides to change the channel on the radio because it was getting annoying. But when he did, he found that there was no other channel. Victoria explained that because they were out in the country, they couldn't get a signal from any stations except that one. So Victoria goes to bed and Steve says he'll do the same in a bit. He started to hear the sounds again and was afraid of what they were going to do to him this time. He thought about it and realized that being alone was worse than being with Victoria. He knew he wouldn't be able to rest, but at least she would be there with him. The only time he was okay with being alone was when he was working on the games, of which he had now finished the third game. I really question how he finishes the game so fast because it's implied that this is literally the exact same day he started working on it, which doesn't make sense at all. So Steve begins walking through the hallway to his bedroom when the walls start pulsating and a giant spider falls through the ceiling. Not joking. Then it opens up its abdomen and hundreds, maybe thousands of spiders fall onto him, covering him from head to toe, crawling into his ears, his nose, his mouth. And now I'm not afraid of spiders, but reading that actually did make me a little queasy, and I can't even imagine what it's doing to those of you who are actually afraid of spiders. Victoria comes running out, wondering what's going on, and Steve yells that he's covered in spiders and not to touch him because they'll get on her too. But Victoria tells him that she doesn't see any spiders, and when she says this, Steve realizes that they are suddenly gone. Steve believed this place had been making him go crazy. He exits the room and notices the smoke alarm and realizes that the constant ringing sounded like a constant smoke alarm. He believed if he destroyed the smoke alarm, the ringing would stop. Now, I just want to remind you guys that all I knew about the story beforehand is that Steve was the game developer mentioned in FNaF VR and supposedly lost his memory. That's it. I didn't know anything else. And I also want you to remember that I write these scripts for my summaries as I read the stories, so that you guys get the important details that might be necessary for conducting theories, and to help me make note of them to help me conduct theories as well. And remember that when I'm finished reading the stories, I don't go back and edit the script. I leave it as it is. Sometimes when recording, I briefly reference it if I end up being wrong. All I do in that case is say what my original thought was, but I don't remove or anything or change the idea. Hell, I've done that in this video, but I don't add any ideas to the script post-reading because that's kind of just cheating. So I swear, I'm not lying to you guys when I say that I fucking called it. Steve destroys the smoke alarm and the ringing sound stopped, but he suddenly heard mechanical whirring and the sounds of gears turning and stuff like that. he just hears mechanical sounds. But not only that, the whole house actually literally looks different now. I think by now you can see what's going on, and I'll talk about it further when we finish the summary. As the whirring sounds grow closer to Steve, he begins to panic and hides in the coat closet. He hears Victoria calling for him, and her voice is coming from the living room, but Steve doesn't hear her footsteps, only the mechanical sounds growing closer. Steve takes a peek out of the closet and sees a robot in the middle of the room. The robot looked nothing like a human except a mask on its face looking faintly feminine, and it didn't take him long to realize that the robot was Victoria, or rather he had been calling it Victoria for however long he'd been here. Steve then realized that the children were in danger from this thing until he saw that they came out and saw that they were robots too, having their own smaller masks with robot eyes and exposed mechanical parts. The robots called out for their daddy at first, but then began using more mechanical and aggressive voices. But he still heard DJ Dan the Music Man on the radio saying, and I quote, "Stay in and stay safe. Well, everybody except you, Steve." Yeah. Steve was genuinely terrified and believed there was no way this could be happening. DJ Dan then said, "Steve, buddy, you need to come out. Your family's looking for you. Playtime's over, Steve. Victoria, Abigail, Avery, they're all getting worried about you. You don't want to worry your beautiful wife and children, do you?" End quote. Yeah. Can we talk about the fact that he says your family's looking for you, which is a line Chica says in Security Breach? Probably means nothing, just wanted to point that out. Also, playtime's over. What's this, Poppy Playtime now? Also, to anyone who has seen the 2017 It movie, this should feel kind of familiar. One of the most unsettling scenes in that movie is when Henry Goddamn autocorrect. It says Henry Showers. I meant to write Henry Bowers. Or rather, I did write Henry Bowers, and it autocorrected because I wrote this on my phone. Goddamn autocorrect. One of the most unsettling scenes in that movie is when Henry Bowers, after being given a knife by Pennywise, enters his house, his abusive dad sleeping on the couch, and the children's show turns to look at the camera, and all the children and the adult lady tell Henry to kill his father. You know, the show that shouldn't at all be able to talk to one specific person and see what they're doing, but somehow does because Supernatural! Yay! It's honestly so cool, and I love how this story does it too. This is such an awesome and unsettling scene, and I think it's pulled off very well. Steve decides he needs to make it out of here, so when the robots look in the kitchen, Steve runs towards the bedroom. He hears Victoria's voice in the hallway, and Steve hides in the bathroom tub. The robot finds him, and Steve shoves it away and ran to the bedroom, throwing the door closed and holding it shut. All three robots tried pushing the door open, but Steve held it shut. He heard the voice of DJ Dan the Music Man on the radio telling him that all he had to do was press one button and everything would go back to normal. His life was miserable before the job offer, but now he had the chance to fix it, and keep the life he had now, just by pressing the red button on the radio. The night terrors were just to inspire Steve for the game. If he wants them to, they will stop. Everything Steve has ever wanted was at his fingertips. Quite literally, if he presses the button, you know, because then the button will be at his fingertips. Haha. Ha 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 ha. Stupid joke. Anyway, Steve let go of the door and walked over to the radio, pressing the button. The whole room started to spin suddenly, but it stopped just as suddenly. He stood up and turned to see Victoria standing in the doorway wearing the same green dress she wore on their first date. He hugged her, he kissed her, and felt too perfect in doing so that, quote, he barely felt the continuous stabbing in the vicinity of his heart. And that's where the story ends. This story was... I don't even know what to say. This story was absolutely incredible. Not only is it amazingly written, not only does it give us actually interesting lore, but it is just as incredible as a standalone horror story as it is as just a FNaF story. But there's quite a bit of lore to talk about here. First, Steve is the indie game developer from FNaF VR. I mean, obviously. Steve is the Scott Cawthon stand-in for this FNaF universe. He made the games, but he originally rejects the offer. This story really just shows the evil of Fazbear Entertainment. You may remember a little over a month ago that I made a video talking about why Fazbear Entertainment is just as evil as William Afton. A lot of people told me that that was kind of obvious, but the point was just to show how. It's something people kind of just know because it's pretty self-explanatory, but no one pays attention to the actual reasons behind it. That's why I made the video, to explain how and why we know that they are evil. But this story is by far the greatest example of that. Remember, Tape Girl tells us in FNaF VR that Fazbear Entertainment hired the game developer to make light of the murders and lead people to believe that they were just made-up scenarios. But Steve at first rejects the offer. But DJ Dan the Music Man, who could be Brock Edwards or another Fazbear Entertainment employee speaking through the radio, pretty much tells us that Fazbear Entertainment is behind all this. They created an entire fake life for Steve just to get him to make these games. They made robots and made them act as his family and gave him night terrors as inspiration. This just shows the lengths Fazbear Entertainment will go to just to get what they want. The more interesting thing to me, though, is the ringing. The high-pitched ringing was coming from the fire alarm, and when the alarm was destroyed, the amplified world reverted back to what it had originally been. This reality is made using illusion discs. In the Twisted Ones, illusion discs are put into lights to make a decrepit underground restaurant look like a terrifying one. But when Clay shoots the lights, destroying the illusion discs, the world reverts back to normal, or the restaurant reverts back to what it actually is. The fire alarm has an illusion disc in it that is releasing a high-pitched sound that overwhelms your brain, causing it to see what it expects to see. Because our brain cuts corners in order to perceive the important things in the world, since we are constantly presented with too much information to process. This is how the illusion discs work in the Twisted Ones and the Fourth Closet, by releasing a sound to overwhelm our brains into seeing things that aren't actually there. Seeing what we would expect to see. This solidifies the idea that illusion discs do exist in the game's timeline, which is interesting because it can support the idea of Gregory being a robot. It's interesting to note that there are actually 2 robot children and 1 robot adult that wear human-looking plastic masks and use illusion discs to make them look human. The same is what happened to Charlie in the Silver Eyes trilogy. I had the idea that if Gregory is a robot, it could explain the 3 human-looking rubber masks that Vanessa ordered, masks maybe to finish the Gregory robots. These robots would likely have illusion discs as well, and that is exactly what we see in this story, robots with illusion discs to look like humans. Whether you like the idea or not, Gregory being a robot isn't confirmed, but it is still very possible, and the story solidifies the idea that such a thing could potentially happen. Also, remember earlier when I said that I had the idea that since FNaF VR doesn't show FNaF 4, but different variants of FNaF 4, that it could have been a mashup game based on his night terrors? Well, it turns out I was wrong. See, before the spiders came down, it is said that Steve had only completed 3 of the 4 games, and Steve is killed by the robot Victoria at the end of the story, which takes place the exact same night. This confirms that FNaF 4 didn't actually have a game equivalent in universe, meaning that all the other minigames were built from scratch by Fazbear Entertainment specifically for the VR game. That also does explain, even better than my idea, why there is only FNaF 1, 2, and 3, but no 4 in FNaF VR, because Steve never finished the 4th game. But anyways guys, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, then please leave a like and subscribe if you want to. My next summary video on the second story halves will hopefully be out tomorrow, but given the fact that this video was meant to come out like 2 days ago, no promises, but I will try to read the story today and get the summary out tomorrow. Just forgive me if I can't, but anyways, I'll see you guys in that video, and that's all. Bye guys!